This week's portion, I want to begin by referring to just the first opening 6 verses, which talks about the removal of the ashes, which is the requirement to remove the ashes from the altar. And then we're going to talk about what the significance of that is. And then after that, we'll move on to some of the insights from the great rabbis on our portion. So it says, first of all, we should note that as an introduction to our portion in general, you should note that this portion appears almost nondescript. That's the example. That's the word used by the Chabad Chumash to describe it. Basically, on the one hand, it's just a continuation of the laws of the sacrifices which were listed in Parashat Vayikra. And the second half is simply a restatement of the Miluim ceremony, the installation rites, which Aaron and his sons needed in order to be able to serve in the temple. So all of these things doesn't jump out at you, except the first thing that jumps out of us is this word Tzav. The word Tzav is this commandment that's unusual. This is the first time in the Torah we're seeing that. Tzav, command, meaning to say, as Rashi says, Ein Tzav ela lashon ziruz. Tzav means with haste, quickly. Miyad u'adorot, immediately and for generations. So therefore, there's this commandment when, especially by something which we think is sort of commonplace or we already know it, there's a commandment to rush to it, to not take it for granted. And especially, says Rabbi Shimon, B'yoter tzarich hakatuv l'zarez b'makom sheyesh bo chisaron kis. A person especially needs to urge himself to rush to do the mitzvah when there is an example where he's going to lose money. So therefore, we have to rush, especially, we have to use this word of zrizus when there's a concern that we could possibly lose money, and when we will be losing money, because in these cases that we're going to be giving sacrifices, so we lose money. Also, the priests are not going to get any benefit from the Ola offerings. The Kohanim are also going to be losing money. And so therefore we have to say, command Aaron and his sons with zrizus. You should explain it to them with emphasis, the importance of following them exactly. And do not just speak, but tzav, express the command as passionately. By the way, I want to just say, as it comes to spending money, that everybody, when you prepare for Pesach, should be sure to give some money to the poor, called ma'ot chitim, money for quote unquote wheat money. That as we observe our Seder, there are people who are less fortunate, who need money, need help. I want to recommend 2 charities, one in the area, one in Israel. And in Israel, of course, we said a prayer at the beginning, but we mentioned it again, that one is in Israel's Leket, which gives out food to people who are poor and need food. And in the local area, a kosher food pantry called Yad Yehuda. I want to recommend, if you want to support people who want to have a Pesach Seder locally, that's a kosher food pantry that I recommend. Anyway, so God says to Moshe, Tzavas Aaron v'espanav, command, meaning with alacrity, Aaron and his children, saying, Zos Toras Ha'olah. This is the laws of the Olah. This is the law of the Olah offering. Hi Ha'olah, this is the Olah offering, Al Mokdah Al Mizbeach Kol Laila, which will be burnt on the fire all night until the morning. Ve'esh HaMizbeach, and the fire of the altar to Kadbo will be burned through it. Now, this idea of Mokdah, that it is burnt, and is burnt on the altar, the letter mem for the Mokdah is small. letter meant for the word mukta is small. And this is something we commented on in the past, that whenever time you have a small letter or a large letter, the Baal HaTurim is of the opinion that every single letter in the Torah has one, in the Bible has one large and one small. So we just look at the Baal HaTurim. What does he say about the word, about this verse? So he says, hold on. So what does he say about Tzav es Aaron, command the Jewish people? So the Baal HaTurim says, Maksiv wa Elmine. What's the verse immediately prior to that? Immediate prior to the verses, the Kiper Lav HaKohen of Nei Hashem, that the Kohen shall use this as an atonement before God, and this will be what's called the Asham, the carbon Asham. If a person will have sinned with this carbon Asham, and he needs forgiveness, Asher Yasel Ashman Ba, that this is everything that he did to achieve guilt. So what do we do from this? What's the connection between something that you did to achieve guilt? Then it follows Tzav es Aaron, command Aaron. So this teaches us that we need to be, says the Baal HaTurim, Zrizim Torah mitzvos. We have to be alacritous with Torah mitzvos. Sheshigos Talmud Olav Zadon. What causes us to commit an accidental sin? If we're not in that what causes us to commit this accidental sin is if we're not engaged in doing good things. Only when we're engaged in doing good things, meaning to say, if we're engaged in Torah study, if we're engaged in doing mitzvahs, we're not going to accidentally sin. It's going to prevent us from committing this sin. And that's the concept. That's the concept. So basically, the best. And I just want to say one more thing about the commandment to do something quickly. I'm sure I said this many times, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that anything worth doing is worth doing right away. So when it comes to a mitzvah, you need to try to do it as quickly as you possibly can. That was one of the powerful things of this protest in Israel last night that happened immediately. That it wasn't like planning. Immediately after Netanyahu fired the defense minister, all of a sudden you saw tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews went to the streets right away. That's the power of immediacy. It shows what's so important that you don't want to wait for. If you wait for something, then it shows that it's not bothering you, it's not overwhelming you, it's something that's not as important to you. Okay, so then the Kohen, what does he need to do? So this is the law of the Olah. So the Olah is burning all night. So this offering is burning all night. So we have this animal, and I know this is a difficult image for some people to bear in mind, but this animal is burning on the altar all night. So now what happens when something is burnt all night? Turns to ashes. So now in the morning, the Kohen has to put on his linen garments. He has to get dressed up in his priestly garments. And he should wear his pants that are linen directly. And he has to pick up the ashes that the fire consumed when it consumed this Olah offering on the altar, and he shall take these ashes and he has to place them next to the altar. So basically, what does he do? He puts on his priestly garments. This is the first service of the day, which precedes everything else. And in fact, the Talmud and Tractate Yoma tells us a terrible story that the people were running up to do this action, and there was a terrible event that happened, that everybody wanted to do this, and one Kohen actually stabbed the other Kohen. So what does he do? He takes a rake and he lifts out the ashes from the inner fire, and which had been collected over all night from those that were burnt on the altar. And then he puts these ashes next to the ramp on the floor, next to the ramp, to the east side of the ramp, on the south side of the altar. Now, what does he do? Ufashates begadav, v'lavash begadim achirim. Then he removes his garments and he puts on other garments. So what are these other garments that he puts on? non-sacred garments. What does he do? He shall take the remaining ashes. It was only the innermost ashes which he had to remove every single morning, and then when that happens, he has to take the ashes that he puts down. They'll be collecting next to the altar. They'll be piling up. But that was so. Therefore, when they got too much, he had to put on other clothes, which are not the sacred clothes, and he needs to take the ashes out of the temple. And so, and then where does he take them? He takes them al makom tahor, to a pure place, not in the temple, but outside the temple. We'll come back to that in a moment. What's the significance of the Torah basically telling us you need to remove these ashes? So, and then it states, the fire on the altar must burn, can never be extinguished. And the Kohen needs to burn on that fire wood every morning. And he puts the olah on it, and he puts the fats of the shlamim on it. The fire shall burn on the altar, shall not be extinguished. So this is basically known as the two commandments here are that there needs to be a fire on the altar at all time, and there also needs to be that the ashes, this is the action of the removal of the ashes. Every day, the first service in the temple was the removal of the ashes, and then after it piled up, you had to remove the ashes that had piled up next to the altar and take them outside the camp. What's the significance of this? So here we turn to Lubavitcher Rebbe. To me, the Hasidic thought is always so powerful when you come to something as mundane as removing of ashes to find tremendous significance. And here it's what the Rebbe writes. The Rebbe writes, whereas the parts of the animal that are burnt ascend heavenward, that signifies the aspects of the physical world that can be made spiritual, i.e. these animal parts, the physical, are being brought up to God. The residual ashes, the ashes next to the temple, that signifies, and this is very, very shocking to read this from the Rebbe, but it signifies, listen to this line, the mundane necessities of life that remain outside the realm of revealed holiness. The Rebbe is saying you have to remove these ashes because they signify the parts of life that aren't allowed to be included in the realm of holiness. I would have thought just the opposite. I would have thought that it signifies that even the removal of the trash, so to speak, is holy. Saying no, the Rebbe is saying just the opposite. That sometimes we have to take certain aspects of our life and remove them from our life. This is what the Rebbe writes. Placing the ashes near the altar refers to the loftiest way of performing mundane activities, in which we transform the mundane activity itself into an experience of knowing God. So that's why we put it down there. We have to be cognizant of the fact that even the mundane is part of knowing God, but the time for the removal of the ashes and placing it next to the altar was before the sacrificial services began, before the daily offering. So this is telling us that this activity, this mundane activity, is only preparation for a truly holy activity, which is studying the Torah and performing its commandments. And here's what the Rebbe writes: the ashes that are taken outside the camp allegorically refer to those mundane activities which we cannot muster enough inspiration to transform them into holy acts. And so therefore, we are the ones who belong inside the tabernacle, but not the ashes. Really, inside the tabernacle has to be the completely holy pursuits of praying to God, studying Torah, performing commandments. We have to remember that in the holiest places, we should reserve those places for the holiest of activities. The Hasidic thought is usually making the physical and turning it into the spiritual. And that is true as part of the sacrifices. But the Rebbe is saying there are certain things that don't belong in the tabernacle. Certain things don't belong in the temple. And we have to, this is symbolic of that we have to remove those things. By the way, that is a very sharp statement. Even, today, there are certain things that don't belong in the temple. They just don't belong there. They don't belong in the synagogues either. So the Torah tells us that we must tend to these ashes only when they accumulate to the point that they impede the fire's ability to consume the offerings. As long as we can continue our divine pursuits unhindered, there's no reason to be distracted by material concern. The only real justification for engaging in material pursuits is in order to enable or enhance further holy activity inside the tabernacle. So this is what the Rebbe is saying about the removal of the ashes. I'm going to just pause here and see if anybody has any questions about this activity. Hold on one second.